our next panel on the topic of supply chain and circular economy. Like Shifaq said in the previous section, we could have had another 2 days of event just on this topic, right? So I put them at a difficult task to explain everything about supply chain and circular economy. But of course, today, given the theme of business and climate change, they're focusing on how supply chains and circular economy can help us achieve decarbonization. But before I turn it over to the panel, let me introduce our moderator. Throughout the day, you've met lots of great students from our different program, and now it's my pleasure to introduce Alice Norton, who is an undergraduate business school student here at McDonough, and she is studying operations analytics and with a minor from the School of Foreign Service in Science, Technology, and International Affairs. She's also part of our undergraduate Sustainable Business Fellows program. You met our Masters in Environment and Sustainability Management program. You met our MBA certificate students. That's the other third program we have at the undergraduate level. What's really cool about it is that it's not just open to the big McDonough undergraduate students, but to undergraduate students all across the campus. So it's actually an interdisciplinary group of students who every year choose to specialize in sustainable business as Sustainable Business Fellows. Alice is really interested in green energy technology and shifting towards decarbonization, so a perfect person to moderate this panel. So I'll turn it over to her to introduce our panelists, two of whom are alums, which we always love to have them back to talk about all the cool work they're doing. Alice.
Well, thank you, and welcome to Kevin, Scott, and Vanessa. Welcome back, I should say. I'm very excited to talk to you today about supply chains and their role in companies' decarbonization strategies, because these will pose both challenges and opportunities for the decarbonization effort. So Scott was previously the is currently the Vice President of Sustainability at the Can Manufacturers Institute, and was previously part of the Sustainability and Circular Economy program at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, and graduated from Georgetown in 2011. Kevin is the Senior Manager of Sustainability Science Products at Amazon, and previously was responsible for supply chain optimization, product development, and had graduated with his MBA from Georgetown in 2013. And then Vanessa is the Vice President of Global Environment and Climate at Schneider Electric, and is responsible for Schneider's environmental strategy and decarbonization roadmap, and previously worked at Microsoft as the Director of Energy, Innovation, and Impact. So I'm very excited to hear all of your perspectives on decarbonizing the supply chain. Each of you represent a different industry, but are all thinking about this topic. In your experience, why and how can we address climate change by decarbonizing supply chains? And Kevin, if we can start off with you.
Okay. So not only do we have supply chain, circular economy, and decarbonization, but at Amazon, industry means like many different aspects. So I think where I'll start on this one is really that supply chain, my previous life at Amazon was really, I didn't realize at that time, quite simple. It's, from my perspective, a good supply chain strategy is about optimizing against a specific metric, figuring out what is the relevant measurement that we need to reduce or increase, and how do I set up an algorithm and then introduce the tech systems that optimize against that. The reason it was easy previously, outside of the sustainability domain, is that nobody disputed what a mile was. Nobody disputed how to measure distance. You know, logistics problems can get very complicated when you introduce things like traveler sales, problem, and you have a lot of different aspects of like multiple nodes that you're trying to connect between. But there is no dispute on the underlying measurement itself. So something that I think is relevant for the group here, and something I haven't really heard discussed much today, is the establishment of baseline measurements, and the idea that there needs to be a fundamental methodology in place for you to know what is the correct way to attribute carbon to this activity. Why that becomes important is now if we're thinking about the relationship between companies and our supply chain integrations, the way that we exchange data, the way that we think about optimizing against a problem, we need to have a fundamental agreement on what the right way is to measure a travel distance. Easier in logistics in some cases because it's miles, fuel, combustion, et cetera. Harder when you enter into our product space where you have manufacturing and all the various ways in which we're thinking about manufacturing. And so I think one of the most important things that we could be thinking about in terms of supply chain optimization is advancing agreed upon methodologies. And there's a few bright spots in that. I think in the EU, for example, product carbon rules, which is essentially a group of industry players who have gotten together and agreed that this is the scope of a milk processing, activity. Like when somebody is selling a carton of milk, we can all agree that these, process flows took place, and if I want to measure the amount of carbon that's assigned to a carton of milk, then that measurement has to include all of these aspects. So you get 100 companies together and they agree upon that. Now we have a foundation upon which we can build and we can exchange the data. Someone like an Amazon can consume that and say, I can attribute that much carbon to my operations of what I've sold of that product. So I think that, the previous world in which I was working, which was just about supply chain optimization and miles driven, et cetera, a lot easier. Now in this new domain, as we're trying to think about things like decarbonization, and if I could expand it even further, sustainability umbrella, thinking about water usage, thinking about biodiversity impacts, the list goes on. Each one of these needs to be predated by the establishment of agreed upon methodology. And I think that is really an important aspect to weave into an already complicated panel discussion of supply chain and circular economy, but kind of the fundamental relationship between companies is data exchange, I think. And so that's an important aspect.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So I agree with the importance of data and measurement. And I think for me, the why of why we should look at this is that so many of the emissions are upstream. PwC put out a report that for a lot of companies, 11 times their own operations emissions, that's what is the supply chain emissions. So it's 11x, right? And that's the case for the industry that I represent. So Can Manufacturers Institute, we represent US metal can makers and their suppliers. Just looking at one of our members, Crown, they make beverage packaging and do some other things. But when you look just specifically at their metal packaging business, the scope 3 or supply chain emissions are 91% of their emissions. So that's the why of why they're looking into this. In terms of the how, you asked about the how too. Well, first of all, it's going to take quite a bit of money. The metal that make up beverage cans, food cans, aluminum, steel, they're part of what's called hard to abate sectors. That's like shipping, aviation, which I know you heard from United Airlines earlier today. It's not easy. We don't totally know exactly how we're going to do it with existing technologies, and it's going to take a lot of money. There is a group called the Mission Possible Partnership. They have put out these sector transition strategies for a lot of these hard-to-abate sectors, including aluminum and steel. And for aluminum, they've said that it's going to take $1 trillion by 2030. For steel, it's going to take more like $4 to $6 trillion, and 2/3 of that money is going to have to go to outside the actual steel-making facilities to decarbonize the supply chain. So that's going to go to things like electricity networks, electricity generation, hydrogen infrastructure. And that was a learning for me that with decarbonizing supply chains, it's often not the literal facilities that are making up your supply chain. Sometimes it's broader problems like the energy infrastructure. I know we just had the renewable energy panel just now, but you kind of have to fix that to drive a lot of the decarbonization you're trying to do in your supply chain. So one is money, and the Inflation Reduction Act certainly helped with that as well. Hundreds of billions of dollars going towards the energy system that I just said we need to help modernize to decarbonize supply chains. Also, innovation. So with aluminum, we're going to talk, I hope, about how having the metal keep circulating, using recycled aluminum is way less energy intensive than making primary or virgin aluminum. We're talking like 94% less carbon emissions from recycled aluminum. But you can also help decarbonize supply chains by reducing the direct emissions. And a good way to do that is with innovation. With aluminum, there's lots of different things you can do: carbon capture, utilization, and storage, inert anodes, hydrogen. Some of these make more sense for other parts of the supply chain than others. That's another key learning I had in looking at these different technologies. There's not one silver bullet. We're going to have to innovate in a lot of different ways. And then on the steel side, so you think steel food cans, that's why I've been looking at that, is there's a lot of use of what's called thermal emissions. So a lot of manufacturing, you have to use a lot of high heat processes to make things. And in the United States, the industrial sector accounts for 24% of greenhouse gas emissions. And a little about half of that, so about 12% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the country are thermal emissions from the use of thermal energy, which is kind of crazy. So people are looking at, okay, how do we reduce those emissions? It can be from carbon capture, utilization, storage, greater use of hydrogen, things like that. And then lastly, I kind of alluded to it, the other how is having more materials circulate. We have a 45% recycling rate of aluminum beverage cans in the United States. Most recycled beverage container in the country, great, but that also means more than half are going to landfill. And that's aluminum that we could recycle forever. If we had a recycling rate of 90%, which is our ultimate goal from some targets we put out, in 2020, if we had a 90% instead of 45%, we'd have enough energy savings to power 1 million US homes for an entire year. So that's what makes me excited to work on. My job is that there are so many emissions we can remove just by having more of the material circulate. So the how, it's really the money, the innovation, and having more material circulate for me.
Thanks. I'll just maybe take two of the points you've said. First, it starts with data, and we need to improve data. And then the second thing you said is supply chain is 11 times typically bigger for any given company. And I'll take a little twist at both angles. Because first, I think we have enough data to start taking action. And we can always improve on better data. But I would say, we have, when you work on sustainability, you have to start with an angle of humility, that we know literally nothing about how systems work and how nature works. But yet, we have already created some of the foundational rules of how to account for greenhouse gas emissions, even though they're very imperfect, particularly for Scope 3. Even on Scope 2, they're highly imperfect. I don't know if they talked about it earlier, like whether location-based emission or market-based emission or emissional, like even more granular data is critical to make improvement. At the same time, it's like we have enough to keep more people coming to the circle. And this is something that we're working very actively with our supply chain at Schneider. Most of our suppliers, we have more than 50,000 suppliers, and that may be a very small number for you on Amazon. But most of your suppliers, I could imagine, like ours, don't even today account for those Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And on Scope 1 and 2 emissions, yet the accounting system can be improved, but it exists. And this is where we all need to start. And so I don't want kind of the perfect to be the enemy of the good on sustainability, because perfection just means we're going to wait more and more time, and we won't necessarily have that time. But yet I agree with you, like there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the standards to move the needle, and to also, to your point on money, to make sure that when a company is investing, they can get credit for their investment. And today there is obviously a lot of inadequacy in the greenhouse gas accounting to enable that. I mean, I know you mentioned aviation before, and United Airlines was there. We are, and Amazon is investing, for example, on sustainable aviation fuels like Schneider Electric. It's very hard as not the direct buyer of the SAF to account for sustainable aviation in your books and deduct the benefit of SAF in your accounting books. And so these equations will need to be sorted out, because otherwise at some point we're all going to stop investing if we still report the same numbers year over year after making more investment. But yet, I think where we're spending a lot of time at Schneider is ensuring that our supply chain can deliver on Scope 1 and 2 reporting, which yet so many companies globally, including companies that soon will have to report due to regulation, whether in the EU or whether with SEC in the US, will have to report on Scope 1 and 2 and are not equipped to report on Scope 1 and 2. And the second point I will take is more the supply chain representing the majority of emissions for most companies globally. And it's interesting because at Schneider it's a bit different, because obviously we sell electrical equipment, hardware, software, but it all connects to the grid. And that means that 88% of our footprint is downstream emissions, so the use of electricity by our end consumers. And our upstream emissions only represent 12% of our overall footprint. And so when you think about at Schneider, like if we were to think, okay, where do I focus? The normal thing would be, well, let's focus on downstream. But then you think about, okay, what are the circle of, kind of how, the circle of influence you have, and it goes back to your point on downstream, it's really you have to transform the grid. You have to accelerate the decarbonization of the grid. And we have a voice, and we have a role, particularly as an enabler of that grid decarbonization with the technology we sell, but we also have a high dependency on the policies and the pace that is set by, ultimately, the voters, I would say. That is really challenging for even our leadership to grapple. Like, what is our role to accelerate the decarbonization of the grid when we're a company that set a net zero target and when we depend so heavily on the grid? So when you look at this, then you shift back to supply chain and think that if it's a little bit more in your control, yet there's a lot of talk that scope 3 is also not totally in our control because supply chain are deep and you choose your tier 1 suppliers, but you don't necessarily have visibility into your tier 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 supplier. Yet we can influence that a lot more via procurement decision and via also design choices that we're making in how we make our products. And so we've kind of rebalanced how we think about the downstream versus the upstream. And it's not that one is bigger than the other. We have to work on both with different tools, policy being a huge one on downstream, but also consumer behavior, because at the end of the day, this is where it really ends. It's like what's, with plugging the equipment. And then on the upstream, really working with our suppliers to educate them, to give them the tools to decarbonize their scope 1 and 2, because it starts, the simple thing we say, it starts with cleaning up your own house before you can turn around and go talk to their suppliers. And each one of us, if we all clean up our own house, there's even discussion, if everybody really took care of scope 1 and 2, there would be no scope 3. But obviously we don't live in this perfect world, so we need leaders to all think collectively about scope 3 until everyone is up to speed on scope 1 and 2.
I usually say we have to put our oxygen mask on first, like in the air, but same concept.
That's exactly the same.
Yeah.
Well, we've heard a little bit about some of the overarching challenges relating to decarbonizing supply chains, whether that be the challenges in trying to account for scope 3 emissions or financial challenges as well in trying to track these emissions. Are there any unique opportunities for each of your industries in this attempt to decarbonize supply chains?
Well, I can go first on that one. You mentioned policy and looking downstream as well. And so I was talking about the carbon savings that can come from recycling aluminum beverage cans and steel food cans. And one of the things I'm spending a lot of time now in my job is pushing what we call recycling refunds. You may know it as bottle bill or deposit return systems. So in 10 US states today, when you buy a beverage container, you pay 5 or 10 cents, and then you can get that money back when you return it. So you're using that financial incentive to get more people to return containers. And the data shows that that leads to much higher recycling rates. Like in 2019, the aluminum beverage cans sold at the deposit had a recycling rate of 77%, whereas the aluminum beverage cans made without one only had a 36% recycling rate. So it's difficult to push new policy, changing the status quo. This isn't inserting some language in an appropriations bill. This is fundamentally changing how people buy beverage containers, and there are some legitimate concerns of, is it going to be easy for all communities and people to redeem their containers and get their money back? Retailers don't want to deal with having redemption at their stores for a variety of reasons, including some safety issues. There are some beverage brands that are concerned about sales if people have to pay a little extra even if they're going to get the money back. So there's all of these concerns when you have to change the status quo, but policy is really the best way to drive changes at scale. And having that financial nudge can help change behavior for sure. A lot of people say, oh, just communicate more, tell them to recycle. It's not, hasn't gotten the job done. We need that financial nudge to get people to take that extra step and get into the 70, 80, 90% recycling rates that we want to get to.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off that because the incentive structure, I think, is spot on and is the bright spot. I mean, there's a couple of ways that you can go about creating incentives. One is, more of a stick. The other one's more of the carrot, right? And one of the things that Amazon did in 2022 report is signal to our suppliers that we're going to expect Scope 1 and carbon disclosures from them as part of our contract agreement. And so that's a policy that you can kind of enact with scale when you have a company at scale that has a lot of suppliers. That as depending on the size of our account or relationship with those suppliers, could be the catalyst for them to actually make that change, or work on whatever the repercussions are. The more positive spin, the carrot approach of the incentive structure is like their scope 1 is my scope 3, right, and vice versa. And something that is unique, I think, in the sustainability domain is, previously when we were talking dollars, you want to negotiate and try to extract as much from either side, and so the negotiations are very often challenging because you have, a couple of arrangements that need to be figured out here. But in this particular example that I'm talking about, we have the mutual incentive to both try to lower and get credit on both sides of the table. So it should be a much easier relationship, incentive-wise, incentive structure, if, zooming out a little bit to earlier discussions, if the supporting policy around those companies indicates it so. So I know that the ESG concerns around, in an earlier panel, or I can't remember who was speaking about it, but was concerned around how that might have a negative impact on people, thinking more in terms of aversion, or trying to think of disclosure as a requirement due to liabilities for shareholders. I actually lean into that a little bit more on the positive side, and think having a baseline expectation of disclosure is an important thing across the board, because then that allows this exchange that I'm talking about on data to happen. There are some innovations that need to take place. To your point, like the challenge of standards, there's good enough measurement. I mean, at the broadest level, you can do I'm in sector X, I'm going to go and look at my spend, the EIO method, and take the multiplier and accept that as an expression of the amount of carbon that I'm emitting, and I'm going to log that in my books, and the company's going to use it. Well, that's not very good, because now I'm just using the average number, right? And so to get a more granular, specific measurement, that company needs to be more incentivized to be thinking about the abatements that they want to take credit for, and therefore the new splitting out of the actual activities and getting the support on it. So on that lens, not speaking as an Amazonian here, just speaking as a person wanting to see this happen, lean more into free data exchange platforms. I love the idea of having methodologies published, having models available, having an open exchange, so that a company can pick that up and use that and integrate it in their systems, rather than need to go pay a consulting firm to come in and do some specialized measurement that's probably more of a tailor fit than's actually needed for their purpose, and they could get away with a lighter expense, not as tailored approach to their own measurements. So I think there's a couple of things that need to kind of happen in that, but the opportunities, in this industry, as I'm thinking about it, mostly in terms of the, seller relationship, is those incentive structures need to take place, and we need to kind of realize that there is a mutual incentive that we have, and that's different than the previous negotiations that we had on dollars, where you extract and it's a zero sum. It's actually quite different in this context. We're both trying to get to zero, right? So it's, I think, hopeful.
Maybe, another angle we're taking, zooming out again on the supply chain, is because, again, maybe of the equation I presented earlier, we're really thinking for a decarbonization strategy, to go cradle to cradle, even though I know I shouldn't use that term because it's it's deposited, but it's more going from the design phase down to the end of life, as you said, and really thinking about each step of the way. What are the relationship of the infrastructure that you depend on, or what are the policies that are enabling anything? And so definitely on the design phase, we feel like there is so much more data that's needed, and much more than, in fact, the carbon. I think we're all working a lot on life cycle assessment rather than just the carbon footprinting, because carbon is obviously the challenge of the decade, but it doesn't end there. We do have a biodiversity challenge where we've lost 70% of biodiversity over the last 50 years. And so it's how do we already integrate some of the trade-offs that we are immediately facing? And we're facing some of these trade-offs as we get into the second phase of our cradle-to-cradle approach, which is more after you've designed, how do you source material? And for example, we've decided to source 50% green material in weight in our products by 2025, and that applies to steel, aluminum, copper, and plastics. And when you're making changes between different options or between different materials, they may be a benefit on the carbon side, but there may be a downside on the water side or on the biodiversity side. And one example that I'm sure resonates with Amazon or a lot of the packaging companies would be on packaging. We have also another target, which is getting rid of single-use plastic. And there is a lot of discussion around the International Plastic Treaty and so the easiest is obviously going for no virgin material, very similar to what you were proposing for aluminum. But there's also going towards more cardboard. But cardboard can have a huge impact on biodiversity and deforestation. And so it's like understanding these trade-offs and going back to, yes, we have enough data, but yet we don't know anything. It's kind of like a bit of the world we're in. It's the same on plastic. When we look at life cycle assessment or like the impact of plastics, we're starting to work with a couple, the Museum of Natural History in France, for example, on this. We don't even know properly how to measure the microplastics impacts of plastics. So the leakage to the ocean is very poorly measured in life cycle assessment. And so until we're able to really understand, when you present kind of the numbers to your CFO and you don't even have a full picture, it's very, very complex. I mean, it's very, very hard to justify. Like, yes, we should end plastic, and yet at this other time you're showing her that maybe more carbon will lead to more deforestation, and she doesn't see the impact on the ocean from plastic. I mean, it's just like that complexity it's definitely somewhere where we need to kind of get a lot smarter. And if anyone in the room wants to do PhDs, I think this is an area where definitely we need more material scientists going in for sure.
And different life cycle assessments can give
Yes.
you different results.
Absolutely. And that's
even
it,
beyond
yeah.
what's in scope and outside.
Absolutely, and going back to, in fact, your standard, this is something we're really struggling with. Like, LCA is indeed the best of like environmental footprint, but it's definitely not comparable. And when we look at like some of the regulations that are coming up, particularly in the EU, that want to get to that world where every product can be compared between each other, which is a word that I want as a consumer, the problem is today we don't have these tools that can really make it comparable. We have bits and pieces, like maybe on the carbon footprint you can get to this world of comparability. But on the full picture, it gets really complex. And so it's like, how do you educate the consumer with that complexity of the natural world in the end, but yet give them and yet be simple enough that they can make choices, because not everybody wants to have a PhD in material science, I guess.
Well, thank you so much for your perspectives on this topic. I hope you'll all join me in giving a hand to our panelists. Looking forward to audience questions for our Q&A, which will begin now.
Yeah, we'll just start talking if there are no questions. So.
I can ask one. Hi. Thank you guys so much for speaking. My name is Ashley Hartwell. I am a research scientist at NIST. And I'm really curious because I think you began to sort of talk to this about this trade-off example that you provided with containers, where you talked about, okay, if we switch to cardboard, that has these other impacts. And I think what you maybe were starting to get to was maybe just like an idea that we need to use less, generally speaking. How do your respective stakeholders, you as companies, think about degrowth? Are you thinking about that in your life cycle analyses and in your future strategies?
That's a great question, and coming from a company that's located in Europe, I can say this is a very, this is a topic that is definitely very vocal, much more in Europe, and I think it starts with efficiency for sure. I mean, everything starts with efficiency, and I think on energy, particularly on the grid, we've definitely have invested a lot of energy efficiency, but we know we need to invest in energy efficiency, for example, at double the rate that we're currently investing in. So there's so much waste in our system throughout that it's first thinking about that. If we could eradicate the waste, whether it's in the food, 40% of the food is wasted, 60% of the energy is wasted, Like if we could first focus on making our system more efficient, and you talked earlier about supply chain optimization, then you need less. And then we didn't even get to talk about this, but obviously it's like, how do you design your products so that you're not relying on new virgin material? And then it's like, I mean, one topic that's obviously also growing with the regulator, particularly in the EU, but also in the US, is how do you make sure that there's no programmed obsolescence and that there's durability or repairability or modularity into the products that you're creating. And that's for sure an area that we've been working for a long time at Schneider. I would say we're a little bit in a different situation in other sectors because we're not like we're durable goods. We're not like a consumer good that has a trend. So it's a little bit different, but we're thinking about that, for example, with UPSs. How do you make, because UPSs are maybe some of those that are like the most need to be upgraded frequently. And so how do you make them more modular, more repairable, more upgradable, so that you don't have to kind of put as much virgin material every time you have a new product coming out. And yes, I agree. It starts there. In the design principles for all of our designers, it starts there. Efficiency and relevancy. Do you need this? Do you need to add this feature? Do you need to create this new product? Right. Can't you fill the gap with something that already exists in the commercial references that we have, and we have many? So it starts there for sure.
I'll go ahead and add to it too, that it's definitely hard to sell the concept of degrowth in corporate America. I'm going to just like give you that like fair heads up early on. So I like the direction you were taking in terms of like waste reduction and design expectations. And so as consumers, you really have an opportunity, I think, to demands from product manufacturers. Repairability is a really important aspect, and the durability as well. As well as the separation of materials. Like why should you have two types of plastics melded together, or a package that contains, or the design that contains a couple of different materials that make it now very difficult or impossible to recover anything from these. Living in Seattle, there's a company that is, I think, starting to branch out into other markets, probably just like Portland and I think most West Coast. I don't know if your last name is Ridwell. You said that. It's just like, but the company's, the company's name Ridwell sounded very similar. I was like, whoa. And Ridwell is a supplement to the public recycling service, and it's essentially a private recycling service that will collect bags of plastic film and the multi-layer plastic and batteries and glass and paints and things that you can yourself as a consumer in a city primarily find where to take these to be recycled, but they just consolidate all that in and do like a biweekly pickup. So if there's more demand of the separation of materials in the design of products such that it can be reintroduced back in, that's a fantastic opportunity. And I would also encourage as consumers, you have the option to buy used. Like I think there's a lot more application of used when you're buying new. And I just last week bought. We have smoothies every morning. I don't know why I'm sharing so much about my life right now, but anyway. And we have a blender, and I was holding my 3-month-old in one arm and dropped my blender in the other arm, and the handle snapped off. And it was a Vitamix that we got like 7 years ago. So I was kind of proud, like, oh, we've had this same blender or whatever. And I went, and you can find a used like new, perfect replacement from that. And it's below the fold. It's not above the fold. So I think there's opportunities to try to flip that script a little bit and have the first option presented to consumers. Is the used like new, so you don't have to send a signal into the market that there's more demand for manufacturing your products. So I think that is one way to participate in a kind of degrowth strategy, is to just insist upon or look for repairability materials, separation of materials, lean into smart companies. And by the way, if anyone thinks that Ridwell thing sounds awesome, make it happen here in DC. Talk to the founder. Like, I think it has worked pretty well in that market. If you have a concentration of concerned citizens, they'll kind of lean into that. These things all together, I think, work in concert very well.
I would have said similar stuff. Like, yes, degrowth would be a tough one. I think if I went in and said, I got a great plan, we're going to sell less cans. Right, yeah. I'd be like, yeah. So I think it is more about reducing the use of virgin materials. And I think we need to think about not only new business models, but how do we make clear that really the best vision of the future is where there is some reuse going on, and reuse, it's not like it always wins. There has to be an infrastructure put in place. Ideally, companies agree to use the same sort of thing so that there's not lots of different kinds of containers, but one kind of container that then can be sent to somewhere to clean it and bring it back all in a tight loop and have it go around multiple times. So that all has to happen. But then explaining that we shouldn't have multiple types of single-use beverage containers. If we just had aluminum beverage cans, those things the metal can go round and round, and we can crush it and dense it, make it more dense as we transport it, and then efficiently recycle it. So that's sort of the vision, to reduce the virgin materials, have some reuse. I don't think that's going away anytime soon, but then make sure that people can recycle and have the best thing that they can recycle be what's put on the market.
I think we have time for one more quick question, so no pressure, but.
I'll try to keep it quick. Hi all, Hadi, first year MBA student. I wanted to ask, do you see any potential in the form of trash sorting or recycling technology to kind of take that, I don't want to say burden, but reduce the effort that the consumer has to play in terms of sorting, our household waste? And do you think the Biden infrastructure bill would help stimulate some of that research and maybe development of tech?
So I will say in recycling, that's kind of, maybe you've heard of companies like Everest Labs or Amp Robotics. The whole business is around robots that go into the single stream recycling facilities where they're sorting it. Material recovery facilities, they're called. There's a couple issues though. The technology sometimes, it's learning from a whole bunch of images what is the thing that it's trying to pick. But it often uses like suction cups. And sometimes it doesn't quite pick the thing that it wanted to pick. And sometimes it picks that thing, but then there's other packaging or materials that are along for the ride that shouldn't have been picked because they were stuck inside or something like that. So the robots are helpful, but I think also part of this is not just putting whatever packaging we want into the marketplace, and then that the people that made that choice talk about financial incentives. They don't feel that at all. So there's a greater move towards what's called extended producer responsibility. 4 US states have passed it. It's in other parts of the world where the people that put that stuff into the marketplace, they pay, and then the fees that they pay are what's called eco-modulated, based on high recyclability, high recycled content, things like that. So I think if we can get rid of the material, the multi-material stuff, the materials that are hard to recycle, then maybe we can stick with single stream. That is certainly more convenient for people. And then if we can make the sortation facilities more modern, that will definitely help. Just yesterday, I believe it was the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency announced more than $100 million from the Inflation Reduction Act and Save Our Seas for solid waste infrastructure. Like I think New Orleans got $3 million to finally get more carts in the households and build up its MRF. So yes, there's a role to play. That was $100 million out of 250 that's coming over 5 years. And then I think there's another 35 million or something for communications. But yeah, the robots are there. They're in a lot of MRFs. Some MRFs are very old. Hopefully they can be modernized with some of this government funding and other sources of funding too.
Yeah, I mean, and this is not my my area of expertise, but once I would just like tie a little bit the previous question and this one. It's sometimes less is more. I think we've gone in materials. We've kind of gone a bit over complex, particularly for plastics. And the challenge of plastic is because they're a mix of plastics, then you can't recycle them. At least not mechanically. You have to do chemical recycling, which is a lot more expensive, where definitely infrastructure investment is lacking. And so it's like, how can we, to your point, like simplify the material that we're using and reducing the diversity of material that's being used so that recycling can really happen. I mean, the numbers are pretty dire for plastic. Less than 5% of plastics are being recycled in the US today. So when most likely you're seeing, in fact, in the bottle that you have in your hands that it says recycled plastic, it's maybe just a slight percentage of recycled plastic, and regulation is coming to really force companies to say precisely what percentage of recycled content there is, but it's very likely below 50%. This is, I think, where we doing less will maybe help to be able to do more on the back end and reducing the amount of virgin material that's being used.
I don't know if you have anything to add.
If you give me the chance, I'll just start talking. I think I'm.
Okay. With that, I again would like to thank all of our panelists for an illuminating conversation about supply chain and circular economy. So please join me again in giving them a hand.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Like Kevin said, the other most dangerous thing you can do is mention something that gives an in for a professor to talk about what they're working on. So I'll try to keep it to 30 seconds. Some of the things that we just heard in this thing, I just got back from a 2-week trip with a bunch of research collaborators where we're really trying to pair all the learnings and research about circular economy strategies, from modularity to reuse to repair, from the business school perspective, along with industrial ecologists who do the life cycle analysis, so that we can actually offer a better tool to policymakers to evaluate that in EU. So if you want to learn more about that, find me. But we'll take a break now. We'll come back for our last session, which is at 4:30, and it's a bit of a different session. It's going to be 3 interesting technology and innovation which we are going to share with you based on some partners that we have. So we've picked 3 different organizations who are doing some really cool innovations and business models and technologies, and they'll give you a short presentation on what they're doing. So see you back here in a few minutes. Thanks.